The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square as thousands of mourners gathered for what would be remembered as one of the most emotional days in Vatican history. Pope Francis had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days earlier, leaving behind a legacy of compassion and service that had touched millions of lives around the world. Marco Rossetti stood at attention near the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, his colorful Swiss Guard uniform pristine, despite the early morning humidity of Rome. At 28 years old, Marco had served the Vatican for 6 years, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the weight of this moment. The Pope, who had revolutionized the Catholic Church with his humility and love for the poor, was about to be laid to rest. The crowd in the square was unlike any Marco had ever seen. People had traveled from every corner of the globe to pay their respects to the man they called the people's Pope, families with small children, elderly pilgrims who had saved for years to make this journey, and dignitaries from around the world all stood together in shared grief. Marco's position gave him a clear view of the entire ceremony. He could see the cardinals in their red vestments preparing for the funeral mass, world leaders taking their seats, and the simple wooden coffin that held the man who had chosen to live in a guest house rather than the papal apartments as the ceremony began. Marco found his thoughts drifting to a memory from 2 years earlier. He had been on duty during one of Pope Francis's weekly general audiences when something unexpected happened. An elderly woman in the crowd had collapsed from the heat, and despite the security protocols, the Pope had immediately stopped his speech and rushed to help her. Marco remembered how Pope Francis had knelt beside the woman, holding her hand and speaking softly to her as paramedics arrived. The Pope had refused to continue his audience until he was assured that the woman was receiving proper medical care. It was a moment that had shown Marco what true leadership looked like now. As Marco stood guard at the Pope's funeral, he carried that memory with him. Pope Francis had taught everyone around him that service meant putting others before yourself. No matter what the situation or protocol demanded, the funeral mass was conducted with the solemn dignity befitting a pope. But there was something different about this ceremony. Instead of the usual formal distance, there was an intimacy and warmth that reflected Pope Francis's approach to his papacy. Cardinal Martinez, who was celebrating the Mass, spoke of a man who had never forgotten his roots in Argentina and had brought the spirit of the streets to the highest office in the Catholic Church. As the ceremony continued, Marco noticed movement in the crowd to his right. A young boy, probably around 8 years old, had somehow become separated from his family in the massive gathering. The child was clearly distressed, looking around frantically for familiar faces among the sea of mourners. Marco could see the panic beginning to build in the boy's eyes. The child was too far from the main security personnel to be noticed. The adults around him were focused entirely on the funeral proceedings. The boy started to cry, his small voice lost in the enormity of St. Peter's Square. Every instinct in Marco's training told him to maintain his position. Swiss Guards were renowned for their discipline and their ability to remain motionless during ceremonies, no matter what distractions might occur around them. The funeral of a pope was the most sacred duty a Swiss Guard could perform, and abandoning his post would be unprecedented. But as Marco watched the child's distress grow, he heard Pope Francis's voice in his memory. During one of their brief encounters, the Pope had told him, "Marco, remember that our uniforms and our protocols exist to serve God's people. If we ever forget that, we have forgotten our purpose." The boy was now openly weeping, his cries starting to attract the attention of nearby mourners. Marco realized that if something wasn't done soon, the situation could become a disruption that would affect the solemnity of the Pope's final farewell. Marco made a decision that would change everything. In one smooth motion, he stepped away from his ceremonial position and moved toward the distressed child. Several people in the crowd gasped as they saw the distinctive, colorful uniform of a Swiss Guard breaking formation during the Pope's funeral. The move was captured by dozens of cameras and broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world. But Marco's attention was focused entirely on the frightened child who needed help. He knelt down beside the boy, his presence immediately calming in the chaos of the crowded square. "Hey there," Marco said softly in Italian, then switched to English when he saw the confusion in the boy's eyes. What's your name? Tommy, the boy whispered through his tears. I can't find my mom and dad. There are so many people. Marco's heart went out to the child. He could only imagine how terrifying it must be for such a young boy to be lost in a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, all focused on such a solemn occasion. Don't worry, Tommy, Marco said gently. I'm going to help you find them. Can you tell me what your parents look like? As Marco comforted the child, he was unaware that his actions were being broadcast live around the world. News commentators were already beginning to discuss the unprecedented sight of a Swiss guard abandoning his ceremonial duties to help a lost child during the Pope's funeral. But Marco wasn't thinking about protocols or consequences. He was thinking about what Pope Francis would have done in this situation. And he knew without doubt that the Pope would have put the child's welfare above any ceremony or tradition. The funeral continued around them. But for Marco and Tommy, the world had narrowed to this moment of human connection in the midst of global mourning. It was a moment that would soon capture the hearts of millions and remind everyone watching what Pope Francis had always taught about the importance of caring for the most vulnerable among us. Asterisk. Tommy, I need you to help me, Marco said, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. Can you remember what your mom was wearing today? The little boy wiped his nose with the back of his hand and thought for a moment. She has a blue dress and a white hat. And Daddy is really tall with glasses. Marco nodded, scanning the crowd for any sign of parents looking for a lost child. The task seemed almost impossible given the size of the gathering, but he had to try. Around them, the funeral mass continued, with Cardinal Martinez's voice carrying across the square through the sound system. Okay, we're going to find them, Marco promised, standing up but keeping a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder. Stay close to me. What happened next surprised Marco completely. As word spread through the nearby crowd about the lost child, something beautiful began to occur. People started quietly passing the message back through the rows of mourners, describing Tommy and his parents to those around them. An elderly Italian woman turned to Marco and spoke rapidly in Italian, gesturing toward a section of the crowd about 50 meters away. Marco's Italian was good enough to understand that she had seen a woman in blue, frantically searching and calling out a child's name. Grazie, Marco said gratefully, then looked down at Tommy. I think someone might have seen your mom. Together, they began making their way through the crowd. Marco was amazed by how willingly people moved aside to let them pass, their faces showing understanding and concern for the frightened child. Several people patted Tommy gently on the head as they passed, offering words of comfort in different languages. As they moved through the crowd, Marco became aware of the cameras following their progress. He could see news crews adjusting their positions to capture the story unfolding in the midst of the Pope's funeral. But he pushed these thoughts aside, focusing entirely on reuniting Tommy with his family. The funeral proceedings continued with their solemn beauty. The choir's voices filled the air with ancient hymns, and the scent of incense drifted across the square. It was exactly the kind of ceremony that Pope Francis would have appreciated, formal enough to honor his office, but somehow still intimate and human. Suddenly, Tommy's face lit up. There, that's my mom. Marco looked in the direction. Tommy was pointing and saw a woman in a blue dress pushing through the crowd with obvious desperation. She was calling out Tommy. Tommy. In English, her voice cracking with worry and fear. The mourners around them immediately understood what was happening and began creating a path for the woman to reach them. Marco lifted Tommy up so his mother could see him more easily. Mom. Tommy called out, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. The reunion was instant and emotional. Tommy's mother reached them within seconds, dropping to her knees to wrap her son in her arms. Behind her came a tall man with glasses, clearly Tommy's father, who looked as relieved as his wife. Tommy, his mother sobbed, holding him tightly. We were so scared. When we turned around, you were gone. This man helped me, Tommy said, pointing up at Marco. He's a soldier for the Pope. Tommy's parents looked up at Marco with tears in their eyes. His father extended his hand in gratitude. Thank you so much. I'm David Peterson, and this is my wife Sarah. We're from Canada. When we lost him in this crowd, dot dot dot, double quotes. His voice trailed off as emotion overwhelmed him. It was my pleasure, Marco replied. I'm just glad he's safe. Sarah Peterson wiped her eyes and looked at Marco's colorful uniform. You left your post to help us, didn't you? During the Pope's funeral? Marco nodded. Sometimes helping people is more important than standing in one place. The simple statement seemed to capture something profound about the moment. Around them, people who had witnessed the reunion were wiping away their own tears. Many were taking photos and videos, but there was nothing intrusive about it. Instead, it was a sense that they had all witnessed something special. As the Peterson family prepared to return to their places in the crowd, Tommy tugged on Marco's uniform. Will you get in trouble for helping me? Marco knelt down to Tommy's eye level. I don't know, Tommy, but even if I do, it was the right thing to do. That's what Pope Francis taught us. Always help people when they need help. Tommy nodded solemnly. As if understanding the weight of those words, despite his young age, the funeral mass was reaching its climax as Pope Francis's simple wooden coffin was blessed for the final time. Marco realized he needed to return to his duties. But he also knew that what had just happened was somehow more important than any protocol as he made his way back toward his position. Marco became aware of the attention his actions had attracted. Camera crews were following his movement, and he could see Vatican officials having urgent discussions on the steps of the basilica. But Marco also noticed something else. Many of the mourners in the square were looking at him not with disapproval, but with admiration and gratitude. Some were even clapping quietly, careful not to disrupt the solemnity of the funeral, but wanting to show their appreciation for what he had done. An elderly priest who had been standing nearby approached Marco as he reached his original position. Young man, the priest said quietly, what you just did embodied everything Pope Francis stood for. He would have been proud. Marco felt a warmth spread through his chest at these words. Perhaps breaking protocol hadn't been a mistake after all. Perhaps it had been exactly what was needed in that moment. As the funeral concluded, and the Pope's coffin was carried into St. Peter's Basilica for burial, Marco stood at attention once more. But everything felt different now. He had learned something about the true meaning of service, and he suspected that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Within hours of Pope Francis's funeral, Marco Rossetti found himself in the center of a media storm that was spreading across every continent. The images and videos of him breaking formation to help lost Tommy had been shared millions of times on social media, with people from around the world praising his compassion and humanity. But Marco was unaware of the global reaction as he sat in the office of Captain Heinrich Müller, the commander of the Swiss Guard. Captain Müller was a stern man in his 50s who had served the Vatican for over 20 years and had never encountered a situation quite like this. Sergeant Rossetti, Captain Müller began, his voice carrying the weight of military discipline. I'm sure you understand why you're here. Breaking formation during any papal ceremony is a serious breach of protocol. Breaking formation during the Pope's funeral is something that has never happened in the 500-year history of the Swiss Guard. Marco sat straight in his chair, maintaining eye contact with his superior. Yes, sir. I take full responsibility for my actions. Can you explain to me what could possibly have justified abandoning your post during one of the most sacred ceremonies we perform? Marco took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Sir, there was a lost child who was becoming increasingly distressed. I assessed that his situation could potentially disrupt the ceremony if left unaddressed. I believed that helping him was consistent with the values that Pope Francis taught us about serving others. Captain Müller studied Marco for several long moments. What Marco didn't know was that Muller's phone had been ringing constantly since the funeral ended. Calls had come from Vatican officials, international media outlets, and even government representatives from Marco's home country of Switzerland. Sergeant Rossetti Müller said finally, Are you aware that your actions were broadcast live to over 1 billion people worldwide? Marco felt his stomach drop. He had known there were cameras present, but the full scope of the global audience hadn't occurred to him. No, sir. I was focused on helping the child. Before Captain Müller could respond, there was a knock on his office door. A Vatican official entered and whispered something that made Muller's eyebrows rise in surprise. Sergeant Rossetti, Mueller said. Standing up? It appears that someone very important wants to speak with you. Marco was escorted to a formal meeting room in the Apostolic Palace, where he found himself face to face with Cardinal Martinez, the same cardinal who had celebrated Pope Francis's funeral mass just hours earlier. Sergeant Rossetti, Cardinal Martinez said, his voice warm despite the formal setting. I wanted to speak with you personally about what happened during today's ceremony. Marco braced himself for what he assumed would be a strong reprimand from one of the highest-ranking officials in the Vatican. I want you to know, the cardinal continued, that what you did today has touched the hearts of people around the world. More importantly, it demonstrated exactly the kind of compassion and service that Pope Francis spent his entire papacy trying to teach us. Marco looked confused. Your Eminence? The Vatican has been receiving messages from every corner of the globe, Cardinal Martinez explained. Catholics and non-Catholics alike have been praising not just your actions, but what those actions represent about the Church's commitment to caring for others. The Cardinal went on to explain that Pope Francis had always believed that rigid adherence to protocol should never come at the expense of human compassion. Throughout his papacy, he'd consistently broken with tradition when it meant helping someone in need. Your actions today, Cardinal Martinez said, reminded the world that behind all our ceremonies and traditions, we are first and foremost called to love and serve one another. That message, delivered at Pope Francis's funeral, seems entirely appropriate given everything he stood for. When the meeting ended, Marco was more confused than ever. He had expected punishment, possibly even dismissal from the Swiss Guard. Instead, he was being praised by one of the most important officials in the Catholic Church. Captain Mueller was waiting for him when he returned, holding a stack of printouts and messages that had accumulated during the meeting. Well, Sergeant Mueller said, looking up at him with an expression that was hard to read, it appears your breach of protocol has created quite a situation. I've received calls from news organizations in 47 countries, all wanting to interview you. Marco waited, still uncertain about his fate. I've been commander of the Swiss Guard for 8 years, Mueller continued, and I've never seen anything like this. Your actions today violated every protocol we have for ceremonial duties. They went against centuries of military tradition and discipline. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. They were also exactly what any decent human being would have done in that situation. And they've brought more positive attention to the Vatican and the values we represent than any public relations campaign could have achieved. Captain Mueller explained that the Vatican was now facing a unique challenge. Marco's story had become a global phenomenon, and how they handled it would be watched closely by millions of people who had been moved by what they had seen. The question now, Mueller said, is how we move forward. Your actions have made you something of a celebrity, Sergeant. The world is watching to see how the Vatican responds to a Swiss Guard who chose compassion over protocol at one of the most significant moments in church history. That evening, Marco returned to his quarters in the Swiss Guard barracks to find his fellow guards waiting for him. Instead of the criticism he might have expected for breaking ranks, he found support and admiration from his brothers in arms. Marco, said Giuseppe, a senior guard who had served for 15 years, what you did today reminded all of us why we're really here. We don't just guard buildings and ceremonies. We serve something bigger than ourselves. The celebration was interrupted by urgent news from the Vatican press office. The story of Marco's compassionate gesture had become the most widely shared Vatican news story in social media history. It was trending on every major platform, with millions of people sharing their own stories of kindness and service inspired by what they had witnessed. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Marco received a phone call from Canada. It was David Peterson, Tommy's father. Marco, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah and I wanted you to know that Tommy hasn't stopped talking about you. He keeps saying he wants to be a helper like you when he grows up. David went on to explain that Tommy's story had already been picked up by Canadian media, and that the Peterson family had been sharing their gratitude for Marco's kindness with everyone who would listen. What you did today, David said, didn't just help our family. You showed the whole world what real leadership looks like. You showed them what Pope Francis meant when he talked about serving others. As Marco ended the call, he realized that his simple decision to help a frightened child had somehow become part of Pope Francis's legacy. The Pope, who had always put people before protocol, had inspired one of his guards to do exactly the same thing at his own funeral. It was, Marco thought, exactly the kind of beautiful irony that Pope Francis would have appreciated. 2 weeks after Pope Francis's funeral, Marco Rossetti found himself in an unprecedented situation. His act of compassion had not only avoided any disciplinary action, but had led to something entirely unexpected. He was being invited to meet with the new pope, who had specifically requested to speak with the Swiss guard who had captured the world's attention, Pope Benedict XVII. The newly elected pontiff was known for his scholarly approach and careful consideration of church matters. Marco was nervous as he was escorted through the halls of the Apostolic Palace to the papal apartments. Unsure what to expect from this meeting, the new pope received Marco in his private study, a warm room filled with books and simple furniture that reminded Marco of Pope Francis's preference for humble surroundings. When Pope Benedict entered, Marco immediately knelt, but the pope gestured for him to stand. "Sergeant Rossetti," Pope Benedict said in accented English, "please sit with me. I wanted to speak with you about what happened at my predecessor's funeral." Marco remained standing at attention. "Your Holiness, I hope my actions didn't cause any disrespect to the ceremony or to Pope Francis's memory." The Pope smiled gently. "Marco, may I call you Marco? Your actions were perhaps the most fitting tribute to Pope Francis that anyone could have given. You embodied everything he tried to teach us about putting people before procedures." Pope Benedict went on to share his own memories of Pope Francis, describing a man who had consistently challenged those around him to think beyond rules and regulations to the human needs that those rules were meant to serve. "Francis often told me," the Pope said, "that our ceremonies and protocols exist to serve God's people, not the other way around. What you did that day demonstrated that you understood this lesson better than many who have studied it for decades." The meeting lasted for over an hour, during which Pope Benedict shared his vision for continuing Pope Francis's legacy of compassion and service. He made it clear that Marco's actions had actually helped demonstrate the continuity between the old papacy and the new one. But the most surprising moment came when Pope Benedict informed Marco that he was being assigned to a new role within the Vatican, one that would allow him to work more directly with visitors and pilgrims who came to St. Peter's Square. "The world has seen that you have a gift for connecting with people in their moments of need," the Pope explained. "I believe we should use that gift in service of the Church's mission." When Marco returned to the Swiss Guard barracks that evening, he found a package waiting for him. It was from the Peterson family in Canada, containing a photo album documenting their entire Vatican visit, including several pictures of Marco helping Tommy during the funeral. But the most precious item in the package was a drawing that Tommy had made. It showed Marco in his colorful Swiss Guard uniform, kneeling beside a small figure under a bright sun. At the bottom, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being kind to me when I was scared." Attached was a letter from Tommy's parents explaining that their son had been sharing his story with everyone he met, and that several of Tommy's classmates had expressed interest in visiting Rome someday because of what they had heard about the kind Swiss Guard. The ripple effects of that day continued to spread in ways Marco never could have imagined. Letters began arriving from around the world, from parents sharing their own stories of lost children, from military personnel who had been inspired to see compassion and discipline work together, and from young people who said Marco's example had influenced their own career choices. A particularly moving letter came from a young woman in the Philippines who wrote, "I saw what you did on television, and it made me want to become a teacher so I can help children too. You showed me that being strong doesn't mean being hard-hearted." The Vatican's social media accounts, which had been sharing updates about Marco's story, reported that engagement had increased dramatically. People from all religious backgrounds were sharing positive messages about the Catholic Church. many of them specifically citing Marcos' actions as evidence of the Church's genuine commitment to caring for others. Captain Mueller called Marco into his office 1 month after the funeral to share some remarkable statistics. "Sergeant," he said, "applications to join the Swiss Guard have increased by 400% since your story became public. Young men from around the world are writing to say they want to serve in an organization that values compassion." Alongside discipline, but perhaps the most significant development, came when the Vatican announced that Marco's story would be included in the official documentation of Pope Francis's funeral, recognizing it as an integral part of the day's events rather than an aberration from them, Cardinal Martinez explained. Sergeant Rossetti's actions during Pope Francis's funeral were not a departure from the ceremony's meaning, but rather a perfect expression of it. They reminded us all that our highest calling is to serve others, especially those who are most vulnerable. As the weeks passed, Marco found himself adjusting to his new role and the unexpected attention that came with it. He began working with families who visited St. Peter's Square, helping to ensure that their experiences were meaningful and safe. It was work that felt perfectly aligned with both his military training and his natural compassion. One afternoon, while assisting a group of pilgrims from Brazil, Marco was approached by an elderly Italian woman who had been part of the crowd at Pope Francis's funeral. "Young man," she said in Italian, "I was there that day when you helped the little boy. I want you to know that what I witnessed changed my understanding of what it means to serve God. You showed us that love in action is more powerful than any ceremony." As she walked away, Marco reflected on how profoundly his life had changed from that single moment of decision. He had learned that sometimes the most important choices we make happen in an instant. When we decide to follow our hearts rather than our fears, the Swiss Guard, who had once worried about breaking protocol, had discovered that the greatest protocol of all was the call to love and serve others. Just as Pope Francis had taught through his words and, even in death, through the actions of those he had inspired. 6 months after Pope Francis's funeral, Marco Rossetti stood in St. Peter's Square on a bright spring morning, watching as thousands of pilgrims gathered for Pope Benedict XVII's weekly general audience. His new role had given him a unique perspective on the daily life of the Vatican, and he had come to understand how his actions that September day had created ripples that continued to spread. Far beyond Rome, the changes in his own life had been remarkable. No longer confined to ceremonial guard duty, Marco now worked as a liaison between the Swiss Guard and the Vatican's pastoral care team. His job was to help identify and assist visitors who might need special attention: lost children, elderly pilgrims having difficulty navigating the crowds, families dealing with emergencies far from home. It was work that felt like a perfect blend of his military training and his natural empathy. Every day brought new opportunities to help people, and Marco found deep satisfaction in knowing that his service was making a real difference in people's lives. On this particular morning, Marco noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was David Peterson, Tommy's father from Canada, but this time he was alone. Marco made his way through the crowd to greet him. "David," Marco called out, "what brings you back to Rome? Is Tommy with you?" David's face lit up when he saw Marco. "Marco, I can't believe I found you. Actually, I'm here because of Tommy. He's been talking about you nonstop for 6 months, and he made me promise to come back and thank you again." David explained that Tommy had become something of a local celebrity in their small Canadian town after their story was picked up by the media. More importantly, Tommy had started a kindness club at his school, inspired by Marco's example. "Every week, the kids in Tommy's club do something to help someone else," David said. "Last month, they organized a fundraiser for families with sick children. Tommy told everyone it was because he learned from you that helping people is the most important job anyone can have." Marco was deeply moved by this news. The idea that his simple act of kindness had inspired an 8-year-old boy to create a movement of compassion among his peers was beyond anything he could have imagined. "There's something else," David continued. "Tommy asked me to give you this." He handed Marco a small wooden cross that had clearly been handmade. He made it himself, in his woodworking class at school. He wanted you to have something to remember him by. Marco accepted the gift with tears in his eyes. The cross was simple, but beautifully crafted. But thank you for helping carved carefully into the back. Please tell Tommy that this means more to me than any medal I could ever receive, Marco said. And tell him that he's the one who taught me something important that day, that when we help each other, we create something beautiful that keeps growing that afternoon. Marco received an unexpected visitor at the Vatican. Sister Maria Gonzalez, a nun from Argentina who had worked closely with Pope Francis before his election to the papacy, had come to Rome specifically to meet him. Sergeant Rossetti, Sister Maria said as they sat in a quiet corner of the Vatican gardens. I knew Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis, for 20 years before he became Pope. I watched him in the slums of Buenos Aires, where he would leave his bishop's palace to sit with the poorest families, sharing their meals and listening to their problems. She paused, looking directly into Marco's eyes. What you did at his funeral was exactly what Jorge would have done. You honored his memory better than any of the formal tributes that day, sister. Maria went on to tell Marco stories about Pope Francis that had never been made public, moments when he had quietly broken protocol to help someone in need, times when he had put human dignity above institutional rules, and his constant reminder to those around him that the church existed to serve, not to be served. Jorge always said that when we face a choice between following rules and following love, love should win, Sister Maria said. You understood that lesson perfectly. As their conversation continued, Sister Maria shared exciting news. The charitable organization she led in Argentina was planning to establish a new program to help lost and vulnerable children in public spaces around the world. They wanted to name it the Rossetti Initiative, in honor of Marcos. Actions at the funeral, we believe that your example can inspire others to act with compassion in moments when help is needed, she explained. We want to train people in airports, train stations, and public gatherings to recognize when someone needs help and to respond with kindness and efficiency. Marco was overwhelmed by the honor. The idea that his name would be associated with an international effort to help vulnerable children seemed almost impossible to believe that evening. As Marco walked through the quiet corridors of the Vatican after his duties ended, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple decision to help a frightened child. His act of compassion had not only avoided punishment, but had led to a new career, international recognition, and now a charitable initiative that would bear his name. He thought about Pope Francis, who had spent his entire life demonstrating that true authority came not from power or position, but from service to others. Marco realized that he had become part of the Pope's continuing legacy, carrying forward the message that love in action was more powerful than any ceremony or tradition. As he prepared for sleep that night, Marco looked at Tommy's wooden cross on his bedside table. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help people, new chances to demonstrate the compassion that Pope Francis had embodied, and new ways to show that even small acts of kindness could change the world. The Swiss guard, who had once worried about breaking protocol, had learned that the most important protocol of all was written in the human heart: the call to help one another, especially in moments of fear and vulnerability. It was a lesson that would guide him for the rest of his life, one that would continue to inspire others long after his own service at the Vatican had ended. 1 year after Pope Francis's funeral, Marco Rossetti stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, wearing his dress uniform and feeling more nervous than he had ever felt in his life. The invitation to speak at the UN's International Day of Human Kindness had come as a complete surprise, but the Vatican had encouraged him to accept, seeing it as an opportunity to share Pope Francis's message of compassion with the world. The journey from that September morning in St. Peter's Square to this moment felt surreal. Marco's simple act of helping a lost child had grown into something far beyond anything he could have imagined. The Rossetti Initiative had been launched in 12 countries, training volunteers to assist vulnerable people in public spaces. Tommy Peterson had become an international symbol of childhood resilience, using his experience to help other children overcome their fears. As Marco approached the podium, He could see representatives from 193 countries looking back at him. Some of these same people had probably watched the live broadcast of Pope Francis's funeral and witnessed his decision to break. Protocol for a frightened child, Your Excellencies. Distinguished delegates, Marco began, his voice steady despite his nerves 1 year ago. I was a Swiss guard, standing at attention during Pope Francis's funeral. In that moment, I faced a choice that would change my life forever. Marco went on to tell the story of that day. But he focused not on his own actions, but on what he had learned from Pope Francis about the true meaning of service. He spoke about how the Pope had taught everyone around him that compassion was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Pope Francis showed us that real leadership means being willing to kneel down beside those who need help, Marco said. He taught us that our highest calling is not to preserve systems or follow procedures, but to love and serve one another. The response from the assembly was immediate and powerful. Representatives from countries around the world stood to applaud, many of them visibly moved by Marco's words. After his speech, dozens of delegates approached him to share their own stories of kindness and service. The ambassador from Kenya told Marco about a new program in Nairobi schools that used his story to teach children about compassion. The representative from Japan shared how Marco's example had inspired a network of volunteers who help elderly people navigate Tokyo's busy train stations. But perhaps the most meaningful encounter came when Marco was approached by a young woman wearing the badge of the Canadian delegation. Mr. Rossetti, she said with a warm smile. My name is Jennifer Peterson. I'm Tommy's older sister. Marco's eyes widened in recognition. He could see the family resemblance immediately. Jennifer. How wonderful to meet you. How is Tommy doing? He's amazing, Jennifer replied, pulling out her phone to show Marco recent photos. He's 9 now, and he still talks about you all the time. His kindness club at school has grown to over 50 kids, and they've raised thousands of dollars for children's charities. Jennifer went on to explain that Tommy's experience had inspired her to pursue a career in international humanitarian work. She was now studying international relations and planned to work for organizations that help vulnerable children around the world. Tommy always says that you showed him what it means to be brave enough to help someone, even when it's difficult, Jennifer said. That lesson changed our whole family. My parents volunteer at refugee centers now, and I'm here at the UN because of what I learned from my little brother's story. After the UN event, Marco returned to Rome with a deeper understanding of how far-reaching his actions had become. The Vatican had tracked the global impact of his story, and the numbers were staggering. The Rossetti Initiative was now active in 25 countries. Over 10,000 volunteers had been trained to help lost or distressed people in public spaces. Hundreds of children had been safely reunited with their families because of protocols inspired by Marco's example, but the most remarkable development came when Marco received a letter from the Vatican's Office of Papal Charities. Pope Benedict XVII had decided to establish a new recognition for Vatican employees who demonstrated exceptional compassion in their service. It would be called the Pope Francis's Award for Human Kindness, and Marco would be its first recipient. The award ceremony took place on the first anniversary of Pope Francis's death, in the same St. Peter's Square where Marco's journey had begun, as he knelt before Pope Benedict to receive the medal. Marco could see in the crowd many familiar faces, Vatican colleagues who had supported him, journalists who had helped tell his story, and families he had assisted over the past year, but the most special guests were seated in the front row. The Peterson family had traveled from Canada for the ceremony, with Tommy wearing a small replica of Marco's Swiss Guard uniform that had been specially made for him. Next to them sat Sister Maria from Argentina, representatives from the various countries where the Rossetti Initiative was active, and a group of children from Rome who had been helped by Marco's new pastoral care program in his acceptance speech. Marco reflected on the year that had passed since that moment of decision at Pope Francis's funeral. I've learned that kindness is not just something we do occasionally when it's convenient, he said. True kindness means being ready to act when someone needs help, even if it means stepping outside our comfort zone or breaking the rules we're used to following. He looked directly at Tommy in the audience. A wise 8-year-old boy once taught me that when we help each other, we create something beautiful that keeps growing. Today, I can see that he was absolutely right. After the ceremony, as the crowds dispersed and the square returned to its normal rhythms, Marco found himself standing in almost the exact spot where he had first noticed Tommy's distress 1 year earlier. Pope Benedict approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Marco," the Pope said quietly, "Francis would be very proud of what you've accomplished, but I think he would be most proud of the fact that you never forgot the simple truth that started it all, that our greatest calling is to love and serve one another." That evening, Marco sat in his quarters writing in the journal he had started keeping since the funeral. He wrote about the remarkable year he had experienced, the people he had met, and the lives that had been touched by a single moment of compassion. But mostly, he wrote about gratitude for Pope Francis, who had taught him what real service looked like. Gratitude for Tommy Peterson, who had shown him the courage to follow his heart. And gratitude for the opportunity to spend his life helping others. As he closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Marco looked at Tommy's wooden cross, now accompanied by letters, photos, and mementos from around the world. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new chances to demonstrate compassion, and new ways to honor the legacy of the Pope who had shown him that true strength lay in kneeling down to help those who needed it most. The Swiss Guard, who had once worried about protocol, had learned that the most important protocol was written in the human heart. It was a lesson that would guide him for the rest of his service at the Vatican and beyond, and one that would continue to inspire others to choose compassion over convention, love over rules, and service over self. In the quiet of his room, Marco said a prayer of thanksgiving for Pope Francis, for Tommy, and for the mysterious ways that a single act of kindness could change the world. He had learned that we never know when our moment will come to make a difference in someone's life, but when it does, we must have the courage to step forward and help. This was the lesson of the Swiss Guards. It's a touching gesture that in our willingness to serve others, especially the most vulnerable among us, we find not only our true purpose, but also our connection to something greater than ourselves. It was a lesson that would live on long after the ceremonies ended and the crowds went home, carried forward by everyone who witnessed what happened when love overcame protocol in St. Peter's Square on that unforgettable September morning.